Hello, and welcome to channel Aron Ra, and I am your host, Voluntary. So Mr. Kent Hovind has a standing challenge. Give your 3 best pieces of evidence for evolution. People have answered, and the conversation generally gets derailed in several places. I don't imagine I'm more qualified scientifically than some of those who have answered the challenge. However, I think, due to my background in philosophy and rhetoric, I might be better suited to take this challenge on. One key aspect of discussion, or especially debate, is to attempt to understand your opponent's position. Think of what that person might raise as objections and counter them in advance. You can only do that if you actually do understand the position you are arguing against. People like Aron Ra know a great deal about science, and everything he said in his video is factually true. However, being more experienced with science and less experienced with debate, people like Aron Ra wind up falling for attempts to divert the conversation. Before we get into the actual subject matter, the 3 best pieces of evidence, we need to go over 2 things. First, what exactly are we discussing when we discuss evidence for evolution? It is easy to get distracted by equivocation between the word evolution and the theory of evolution. The word evolution simply means changes over time. Anything that changes over time can be said to evolve. One example of this is how language changes over time. If you pick up a book of Shakespeare's plays, you will find it has many footnotes to explain different meanings of certain words and phrases between his English and our English. If you pick up the Canterbury Tales, reading it is like reading a different language because that is how much our language has changed since then. Because the English language has evolved, most people need to read a translation of the Canterbury Tales, even though it is written in English. Other languages have evolved as well. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian are all descended from Latin. The French spoken in Quebec is different from the French spoken in France. The Spanish spoken in the Americas is different from the Spanish spoken in Spain. So we can justifiably say language has evolved. Cultures evolve too. There was a time in the Western world when slavery was accepted as normal. Even those who thought it was bad didn't think it would ever go away. But little by little, over time, it did lose support until, in the 19th century, it was eliminated in the Western world. It still exists elsewhere, but now every modern Western person thinks this is an abhorrent practice. This is not the only change our culture has seen. Some of the changes in our culture are good, like eliminating slavery. Some are less good. I'm sure you can think of ways our culture has changed in the last 200 years that you don't approve of. Not all changes are necessarily good, but they are all changes, and therefore our culture can be said to have evolved. We can talk about the evolution of cities. Our huge cities that we have today would have been unthinkable in the past. A huge city in the past might approach 100,000 people, but cities like London and New York have grown over time, bringing asphalt streets, electrical and telephone lines, and infrastructure to sustain millions of people in buildings that would have been impossible in the past, to provide housing and work locations for all those people. Even your own views have evolved. In your early creationist seminars, when you talked about your 6 types of evolution, you included something you labeled chemical evolution. You questioned how elements beyond hydrogen could be formed. Now you question how elements beyond iron could be formed. Somehow, between then and now, someone explained the basics of nucleosynthesis to you. It must have been an interesting conversation to watch, considering how resistant you are to changing any of your views. But your views have changed, and therefore your views have evolved. This has nothing to do with the theory of evolution. As a proper title, the theory of evolution only includes what life does once it already exists. There are several ways I could describe the theory of evolution. I could describe it as random mutation and natural selection. I could describe it as change in allele frequency over time. I could describe it as speciation. Still, what all those have in common is that they say, life is here. What is it doing? As a starting point. This stands in stark contrast to your 6 types of evolution, in which you include Big Bang Theory, formation of heavier elements, formation of stars and planets, and abiogenesis as part of evolution. While you can use the word evolution to describe them, they are not part of the theory of evolution. Just because the word is used doesn't mean they are part of the theory. To conflate the two is an equivocation, which is a fallacy. Also, if you insist that because the word is used, therefore they must be part of the theory, my introduction has demonstrated that you must now count 10 types of evolution instead of merely 6. You must include linguistic evolution, cultural evolution, the evolution of cities, and the evolution of your own views on science. I'm sure with a little bit of work, we can come up with even more things that have been described as evolving and therefore must be added to the list. So the choice is to have your list grow until it encompasses everything that changes over time, or to cut it back to just what the theory of evolution actually is. The second thing to discuss is that you're limiting us to just 3 pieces of evidence. Science works through multiple lines of evidence independently reaching the same conclusion. You like to talk about a mythical conversation between biologists and geologists in which the biologists say, "We need more time to make this evolution thing work." And the geologists say, "No problem, we'll just make the Earth older to accommodate evolution." To make this mythical conversation align more closely with what actually happened, we have the biologist in his lab saying, that's interesting. Apparently, due to the time involved for evolution, the biosphere has to be old. Meanwhile, the geologist is in his lab saying, that's interesting. According to our more accurate dating methods, the Earth is older than I initially thought. Then they meet and both say, "Guess what I discovered?" at the same time. They compare notes and discover that their discoveries reinforce each other. Suppose you are working alongside a police officer conducting a murder investigation. A banker has had to foreclose on several homes recently and then was found shot dead in his office. Ballistics show the type of gun used is a very uncommon type of gun. You interview 7 people. The first one owns the right gun, but has never met the banker, has no idea who he is, and was out of town on the day of the murder. He has the means, but neither the motive nor opportunity. The second one was foreclosed, but does not own a gun, and was out of town on the day of the murder. He has the motive, but neither the means nor the opportunity. The third one is a co-worker of the banker who does not own a gun and was not foreclosed. He worked with him on the day of the murder. He was therefore nearby when the murder was committed. He had opportunity, but neither means nor motive. The fourth one was foreclosed and owns the right gun, but was out of town on the day of the murder. He has both means and motive, but not the opportunity. The fifth one is another coworker who is an avid hunter and owns the right gun, but was not foreclosed. He has means and opportunity, but not motive. The sixth one is an employee of a cleaning company. He was sent to the bank that day to clean and was recently foreclosed. The problem is he doesn't have a gun. He's got motive and opportunity, but not means. The seventh one is someone who has the right gun, was foreclosed, and was seen near the bank at the approximate time of the murder. He's got means, motive, and opportunity. My question to you is, which suspect do you think is most likely to have done it? Mind, there is no video evidence of the shooting, so absolute certainty is impossible. Well, the obvious answer is the seventh person would be the most likely suspect, because 3 separate lines of evidence connect him to the murder. He has means and motive and opportunity. Multiple lines of evidence, independently researched and discovered, are used to support theories. The more lines of evidence there are, the more strongly supported the theory is. No one line alone is considered to be strong. There are more than 3 lines of evidence supporting the theory of evolution. So technically confining it to just 3 isn't fair to the theory. Still, some lines of evidence are better than others, and so should be included in a description of 3 best pieces of evidence for the theory of evolution. Note, I said evidence for the theory of evolution because that is technically what you asked for. Not just anything that changes over time, but the theory of evolution itself. This doesn't mean I'm avoiding discussion of the Big Bang Theory, or the theory of nucleosynthesis, or the various abiogenesis hypotheses. I'm more than willing to discuss any of those, had you asked to discuss those instead. You specifically asked for evidence for the theory of evolution. So, without further ado, my 3 lines of evidence for the theory of evolution. Number 1, beneficial mutations happen. As you know, one of the descriptions of the theory of evolution is random mutation and natural selection. You deserve credit for being one of the few creationists who is willing to talk about both at once. Still, if I'm going to claim that beneficial mutations happen, I should give examples. This has to be something that didn't exist before, does exist now, and is beneficial. Some mutations are beneficial in one respect but detrimental in another, so I will exclude them. For instance, it is known that carrying a recessive gene for sickle cell can give one resistance to malaria, but it has the very detrimental side effect of potentially dying of sickle cell when a person receives 2 copies of that gene. Therefore, it wouldn't be a good example. Another point is that random mutation is not directed. No creature ever decides to evolve in a certain way. It just happens. Take, for example, bears. Different species of bears exist in all sorts of climates, from India to the Arctic Circle, from the polar bear to the sloth bear. A mutation for a warmer, thicker coat of fur is equally likely in both climates. For a bear in the Arctic Circle, that's a good thing. Less work is needed to keep warm. Therefore, more energy can be expended on finding food and finding mates. For a bear in India, that's a bad thing. More work is needed to keep cool. Therefore, less energy can be expended in finding food and finding mates. So sometimes the same mutation can be good or bad depending on the environment. What I'm interested in presenting is an unequivocally good mutation. There is a study that shows conclusively that there is a beneficial genetic variant that did not exist and then did exist. I point to the Lenski experiment. He and his students conducted a 20-year experiment breeding E. coli bacteria. What happened was that they were keeping the bacteria in an inert citrate and feeding them a certain amount of glucose. One petri dish of bacteria suddenly had a population explosion, and it was discovered that the bacteria had evolved the ability to consume the citrate. Due to genetic sequencing, it is absolutely known that the genetic variation in question did not exist at all at the beginning of the experiment. Also, the new trait discovered was the result of two separate mutations. This was 2 stages to create a new trait. So the first stage was not sufficient. It only primed the bacteria for the second stage. This is significant in so many ways. First, due to genetic analysis, we know that this is absolutely a new trait. It absolutely didn't exist prior to the experiment. A brand new trait consuming the citrate appeared. This new trait is beneficial and doesn't appear to have any detrimental side effects. This refutes any claim that beneficial mutations don't exist. Second of all, from my limited understanding, the second mutation couldn't have occurred without the first mutation. This would be something that some creationists would call irreducibly complex. Because if the first mutation doesn't grant the trait to consume the citrate, then why would it exist? Yet here we have a 2-stage mutation occurring right in front of our eyes. This refutes any claims that irreducible complexity prevents multi-stage mutations. Third, those bacteria that have the first mutation but not the second, the ones that can be said to be primed, they were saved and have been subject to experiments, and they evolved the ability to consume citrate by various mutations again. It isn't the exact same mutation, but it does show the same ability evolving more than once. This is actually quite amazing. Still, I can anticipate you saying that this is just bacteria. You are ready to claim that this would not happen in more complex life, such as people. In the northern Italian town of Limone sul Garda, the population includes approximately 38 people who are all descended from Cristoforo Pomoroli and Rosa Giovanelli, who are basically immune to fatty deposits in their arteries and therefore have nothing to worry about with regards to cholesterol. That gives them greatly reduced risk of heart diseases or strokes. They eat the worst diets and have high cholesterol, but don't have any plaque in their arteries. There doesn't seem to be any negative aspects to the mutation they all inherited. Scientists are studying these people in the hopes of creating treatment for cholesterol and heart disease. This mutation does not exist outside that family line. Detailed genetic analysis determined that the mutation is a new thing dating from that couple. People descended from relatives of that couple, such as descendants of siblings or cousins, don't have that mutation. It is theoretically possible that this particular genetic variant has been lurking in this family line for thousands of years, being passed on to just one person per generation. It is not realistic, though. It has not shown up anywhere else. All the evidence points to this being a brand new genetic variant that did not exist before the 17th century. Since it is your position that beneficial mutations do not exist, all I really need to disprove that universal statement is one example to the contrary. Words like always and never are disproved by even a single instance to the contrary. So, beneficial mutations exist. Random mutation alone isn't evidence. It needs to be paired with a second line of evidence for evolution to work. Number 2. Natural selection happens. There are many examples of this. Now, natural selection doesn't need for the trait to be brand new. A trait that exists in a minority of the population can become more prevalent until it exists in a majority of the population if environmental pressures make that trait preferable. Then, if environmental pressures change back, that trait can go back from majority to minority. Which brings us to one of the most famous examples of natural selection. It is only an example of natural selection. It is not an example of random mutation or any other aspect of evolution. It is the peppered moths that you and Aron Ra discussed. I already know what you're going to say. The photographs were staged. Moths don't rest on tree trunks. That is what you said to Aron Ra. Well, moths do sometimes rest on tree trunks. This has indeed been observed. Statements about some people who didn't see it are counter-indicated by statements by others who did see it. So the only criticism is that the photographs were staged. The answer to that is to say, so what? You can't always get a good photograph, so you have to stage it. I recently took a family photo. My family doesn't always stand still in front of a backdrop in our good clothing. Does that mean it isn't a real photograph of my family? Given that the only real criticism of the pepper moth study is that some of the photos were staged, that basically concedes that the frequency of different colors does indeed change with environmental pressures. That is not the only example, but it is one of the best. Other examples include the prevalence of smaller tusks on elephant as a response to poaching. Those with larger tusks are more likely to be poached. Those with smaller tusks survived, so those with smaller tusks reproduced. Then there is the prevalence of certain types of crabs in the fishing waters around Japan. Some of them had shells that looked more like faces, and those were thrown back. Since they were thrown back, they bred more and their numbers increased in proportion to those crabs whose shells didn't look like faces. Now we've got the mechanism for evolution covered. We have both random mutation and natural selection. We have evidence that it does happen. Now we need evidence that it did happen. That brings us to our third line of evidence. Number 3, multiple nested hierarchies. You make the claim that an 8-year-old can tell which animals should be grouped together and which ones should be excluded. And to demonstrate, you give us very rigged tests of 3 similar living beings and one that is very different. For example, you may use a dog, a wolf, a coyote, and a banana. Yes, an 8-year-old could spot the one that is different. You rig the test, so let me offer you a test. Here I present a bottlenose dolphin, a blue mackerel, a European lobster, and a Gila monster lizard. The question is, which of these 4 doesn't belong? Well, you could say the Gila monster doesn't belong because it lives on land. Or you could say the dolphin doesn't belong because it is warm-blooded. Or you could say the lobster doesn't belong because it doesn't have a spine. Or you could even try to be clever and say the blue mackerel should be excluded on the grounds that is the only one that has no reason to be excluded. See, just taking 4 animals and saying an 8-year-old can figure it out isn't sufficient. The answer, as I have envisioned it, is the lobster, because the other 3 have backbones and red blood. Lobsters have shells and blue blood, and a very different body plan from the other 3. You could say that one was unfair, so let's try a different one. Here I present the European lobster again, a flat periwinkle snail, a deep-sea oyster, and a firefly squid. Now let us think. Well, the squid doesn't have an external shell. On the other hand, the shell of a lobster is very different from the shell of a snail or an oyster. Oh, and the internal shell of the squid is similar to the shells of snails and oysters. At first glance, the squid doesn't belong. Upon further examination, 3 of them are mollusks and the lobster doesn't belong. That's the second time. Poor oyster. Alright, perhaps I should do one without the lobster. You like to compare elephants to pine trees. So here's one with those. I present an African elephant, a blue spruce pine tree, a morel mushroom, and a Kawasaki Ninja H2 SX motorcycle. Which one to exclude? Well, the mushroom and the tree don't move, but the elephant and the motorcycle do, so it isn't about movement. This one is tough. So I guess it is probably the motorcycle, because 3 of them are alive and the motorcycle isn't. Sure, the motorcycle displays some similar indicators to living beings, such as consuming fuel, but that isn't enough to say it is alive. What makes this one particularly interesting is that you have used your "one of these things doesn't belong" chart to give an inferential definition of kind. Based on that principle, by your own rules, I just put elephants and pine trees into the same kind. You really have to decide now. Accept that I put them in the same kind based on your own rules, or actually come up with some principle other than "one of these things doesn't belong" chart that allegedly an 8-year-old can solve. Either way, your own principles and arguments will be forced by environmental pressures to evolve again. Now that we've gotten all that out of the way, we can move on to actual taxonomy. And we can move on to what Linnaeus did when he created his taxonomic chart based solely on physical characteristics. He didn't know what DNA is, and he didn't know much about embryonic development. All he knew, and he knew an awful lot, was what animals were physically similar to other animals and which ones were physically similar to other ones. He created a very nice taxonomic tree. This tree, all by itself, doesn't mean that one descended from another. All it means is that if you group creatures based on similar characteristics and continually broaden and simplify the common characteristic, you get a tree that looks like his. This tree, based on physical characteristics, isn't the whole of evidence 3, which I said was multiple nested hierarchies. It is only one hierarchy. There is a second we can look at. The genetic tree is based solely on how similar and how different various creatures are genetically. There are several measures one can take in measuring percent difference. Let's say you have a string of DNA that includes a certain sequence of 30 pairs. If that sequence gets duplicated, is that one difference or 30 differences? Actually, the answer doesn't matter as much as using that answer consistently. Based on this, you can create yet another tree. This one is actually more accurate than the last one because similar environmental pressures can cause similar features to evolve, a principle called convergent evolution. Arctic and Antarctic creatures develop extra blubber to keep warmer. Desert creatures develop similar mechanisms to conserve water. Look at a cactus and a succulent and see that they have some very similar characteristics. But you can't fool DNA. Non-coding sequences and retroviral insertions leave their mark, even if the eye cannot see it. So now we have a second tree. But wait, there's more. There is a third tree based on embryonic development. I can anticipate your reply. You want to discuss Haeckel. If you do, you should know that this line of evidence, this tree, has nothing to do with Haeckel. His theory, that we went through stages that closely resemble those of our ancestral lineage, is discredited. The current evidence from embryology is much more exciting. To simplify it, at the early stages of development, all animals look the same. I will elaborate. New animals start out as a single fertilized egg. That becomes a ball of cells. Then that ball becomes a hollow ball called a blastula. That is the life process of animals that start out as a single cell. Plants and fungi don't do this. If you see a multicellular organism develop a blastula at some stage of its growth, you know it is an animal. Then things get interesting. Most animals turn that hollow ball into a cup. Then a second hole forms and that cup turns into a tube. I would like to say all do this. I think all do. But I'm not a biologist, so I could be wrong. So I will simply point out that many of them do. One branch of animals, the first hole becomes the mouth, and the second hole is used to eliminate waste. On the other branch of animals, the second hole becomes the mouth, and the first hole is used to eliminate waste. We only know this because instead of Haeckel's drawings, we have microphotography to watch embryonic development in real time. Of course, the further you progress forward in time, the more differences become apparent. For instance, pretty early in our development, we develop a head at the mouth end and a spine along the body. We're starting to look different from those animals that don't have spines. But at this early stage, we look an awful lot like other vertebrae. Then, as the first limb buds develop, the similarity to other tetrapods is all that remains, and so on and so on. Much later in our development, but still before birth, you can tell the difference between a human and a pig, but humans and chimpanzees still look almost identical. You can make a chart based on how long different creatures look the same during development. I'm sure that a chicken and a turkey look very similar for a long time compared to, say, a wolf. But that wolf looks similar to a fox for so long they even look similar after they're born. Again, this chart isn't the third line of evidence. The third line of evidence is what happens when you place the charts on top of each other. You find they match. That is the line of evidence. But wait, there's more. You will, of course, notice that we only have all our species at the very ends of the tree, and the whole middle ground is what you would call lines on paper. Of course, those lines on paper are the end result of, and not the beginning of, the classification system. It is rather disingenuous to try to say that we classify things because of lines on paper, when in fact, we draw the lines based on how we classify them. Still, those lines on paper have all these intersections, but what goes there? Well, we have found what goes there in the fossil record. At this point, you will say you can tell nothing from a fossil other than this creature was once alive. You know what? I agree with you. You can't tell anything from it other than it was alive. You said so. I can tell more than that, though. I can tell a lot more from it, and I'm not even a trained biologist. Someone who has studied comparative anatomy can tell much more than I can. You say you can't tell anything from a fossil, and I make it a habit that when someone's disparaging himself, I don't get in the way. Other people can tell things from fossils. Those who actually can tell something from a fossil, they find that they fit on the lines and on the intersections on the multiple nested hierarchies, making yet another hierarchy. A fourth hierarchy of similarities between living beings and fossils that fit in the intersections. Plus, when looking at fossils, we also find whole branches that didn't make it to the modern day, but that is another topic. So not one, not two, not three, but 4 nested hierarchies. When the theory of evolution was first proposed, it was predicted that we would find evidence of this nature. We found it. Now, I'm sure you would say that this is evidence for a common designer. That's not really the case, and I will explain why. You can start a sentence with, if evolution is true, we expect to see. You can also start a sentence with, if creation is true, we expect to see. If evolution is true, we expect to see multiple nested hierarchies. We found multiple nested hierarchies, which means we have evidence. However, if creation is true, what do we expect to see? This is not the same question as what could we see? What do we expect to see? Sure, we could see multiple nested hierarchies, but we have no reason to expect to see it. That is the difference between evidence and explanation. Yes, a common designer could make it look like evolution has occurred, but a common designer could also make it look like evolution has not occurred. In fact, if there was evidence that evolution had not occurred, that would actually be some evidence for a designer. Also, well, if we do say multiple nested hierarchies is evidence for a common designer, even though that is an explanation and not evidence, then it is evidence for a very incompetent, careless, or lazy common designer, because some of the traits that place creatures on these charts are shared flaws. Why do all mammalian eyes have a blind spot? Why do all apes have a broken gene for creating vitamin C? We almost had evidence for a common designer when we discovered that guinea pigs also have a broken gene for vitamin C. But then we discovered it was broken in a different way. I'm not sure you want to say that the designer is either incompetent, careless, or lazy. If evolution is true, then you would expect to see both good and bad traits grouped together as they are in multiple nested hierarchies. If evolution is true, we expect to see this grouping in these hierarchies. We see these groupings in these hierarchies. Evolution passed this test and was not falsified. If this is design, this raises troubling questions about the designer. So there you have it. My 3 lines of evidence are: beneficial mutations happen, natural selection happens, and multiple nested hierarchies exist. 2 of them are evidence that it does happen, and the third that it did happen. Thank you for watching. Since channel Einarchy is a young channel, please help us grow. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and maybe we'll even get to double digits.